Hello, welcome to the fourth lecture in this series, which provides an overview of Focused Ion Beam Microscopy. I am Dr Ben Britton of the University of British Columbia. In this, we're going to discuss fib deposition and etching. This slide deck was produced in collaboration with a range of other people who provided inputs, and they're shown down here. Now, if we're looking at deposition and machining approaches, what we can use is we can have a gas that can enhance the machining process. In this, the important aspect is that the gas can be used to reduce redeposition, and by that process can, in practice, improve the etching rate. This gas will depend, which one you choose and how well it works will depend on the material system and the ion source. And we'll see that can be useful. You can also use it in a selective manner when required. Typically, when we are depositing, so we're going to add material to the surface, it's kind of like nanoscale 3D printing. Here we're going to have something like an organometallic material, and then we're going to interact that with our electrons and ions. The most important aspect of this particular slide deck is to just remember that the film itself is not pure metal. And so that's just really important if you want to look at the properties of that thin film deposition or the structure that you deposit. So that can impact things like the resistivity of that part. So if we're going to look at deposition and enhanced etching, the approach is that we're going to have our focused electron or ion beam, depending on how we do this. We'll see that we're going to use this in both electron and ion modes, depending on what we're doing. And we're going to introduce a precursor gas into the system. And in the deposition process, that precursor gas can absorb on the surface of our material, and then the electron or ion beam can effectively crack and break up this organic precursor to deposit it on the surface of our material. By flooding the surface of material with a suitable partial pressure of gas and scanning the beam across, we can effectively draw or write across the surface of our material. So we're going to use effectively a precursor gas. We're going to crack to deposit platinum, tungsten or carbon rich coatings in here. We can also, if we have an ion beam, we can effectively have the precursor gas to enhance etching, and that can be a fast removal method. We'll see why that's important in a minute. As you're designing the approach to do the deposition or enhanced etching, you're going to balance and get this sorted for the particular material system, the raster approach that you're using, and the current. If you're going to do deposition, you want to have efficient cracking of the organic metallic, but of course if you put too many ions, you can also get milling of that deposited layer and damage into the substrate itself. So you want to avoid that. So you want to balance this, and that becomes quite important of how you optimize the deposition mode that you're using. So if we have a gas injection system, here we see the gas injection needle. It's a hollow capillary needle type process. And this is going to deposit the gas across the surface of our substrate. This is diamond in this case. And we're going to deposit the gas across the surface, and we're going to interact the fib with that. And so this is one example that I found in the literature to show a really nice cartoon. Here's the surface of our sample. Here's the secondary electron, the scanning electron column. Here's the fib column. And we've basically pointed the sample perpendicular to the fib and introduced the GIS, and we flooded the surface. This is the GIS needle. This is a manipulator needle. And then we can effectively, in this area, deposit. We can also have multi-GIS systems where we have multiple input needles. This is effectively a 5-gas manifold where we can have multiple different gases. We might choose which one we want to flow over the surface of our substrate. So this is a multiple GIS that's now sitting on the surface of our part. And we set this up to basically be that the GIS is flooding at the coincident point of our fib and SEM. Now the mechanism of ion beam deposition is basically, and this is from reading this PhD thesis, a significant fraction of the ion beam deposition process is related to the transfer of energy from the primary ion beam via collisions in the gas cloud, and specifically of the absorbed near surface ions, near surface gas. Those primary ions have to have sufficient energy to break the bonds of the organic precursor to cause chain scission. And broadly speaking, if we have more dose, we have more deposition, and it's important that this only happens if we have the absorbed precursor on the surface of our material. The way that this is verified that it works quite nicely associated with the incident transfer of primary kinetic energy from the ions is that effectively if we have this, we can get an almost one-to-one overlap here using effectively a binary collision model associated with the instant ions and the gas cloud. What we see is that effectively more dose requires produces more deposition for ion beam deposition approaches. We see also from looking at the literature that a higher voltage will result in more cracking of the gas because you've got more energy to enable that to happen. But those, of course, ions have more risk of sputtering the surface. So you want to tune a little bit with how much partial pressure of gas is coming out of the gas injection system. Just to recognize that, of course, this entire chamber is under vacuum. So you're introducing a very small amount of gas that is being sucked up eventually by the chamber. So you need to make sure there's sort of a constant nice flow of gas coming out the gas injection system in this case. So in order for you to optimize this, on the instrument, what you're trying to do is you're trying to match the beam current and the raster area with the gas flow rate. If you have too much gas, you're going to impede effectively the cracked organic metallic precursor from depositing on the surface because you're cracking it in the cloud rather under the adsorbed molecules. So you get relatively slow deposition if you have too much gas for your deposition parameters. If you have too little gas, then the ions don't crack the gas cloud and instead they impact with the surface of your material and they can mill away at the material or any pre-deposited layer. Now you'll also have some care with the sputter yield of the surface because actually what can also happen is the secondary ions can interact with the gas cloud and they can also, the sputter yield can change the precursor's adsorption on the surface. Now in addition to I-beam based deposition, you can also use electron beam deposition. This is typically much slower, but necessarily because you don't have the ion beam attacking the surface, it causes less damage to our material. In practice, what we often do is we use a first layer of electron beam protection. So we do an electron beam based deposition to put a very thin layer, and then we build on top of that with an I-beam cap to give us the appropriate thickness of material. We also use that also in gallium fit work as well. Now I just importantly say that the organometallic system is not, of course, the pure metal, and this is related to the precursor gas composition and how that gas is breaking down. But also the way the deposition is done will impact whether you can get an amorphous deposition layer, which is the dream, or if you get a crystalline surface layer. And that crystallinity can create effectively some issues if you're subsequently going to polish through that layer, because you can get effectively things like curtaining induced from the grain structure inside the platinum-rich coating. The properties can also vary. This can be important with regards to, say, the electrical resistivity if you're having a calibrated electrical circuit for anything that you want to do in the system. If we look at effectively the electron beam deposition methods, we again have our gas injection system. The focused electron beam is then enabling us to get chain scission of this to deposit the metallic system on top of this. So this is focused electron beam induced deposition, or FEBID in this case. There's a beautiful thesis from Dr. Sarah Engman that discusses this in a lot more detail. But in short, effectively the gas precursor, what Dr. Egman shows nicely, is that what's required is the absorption of the gas precursor on the surface, and then the electron beam cracks the precursor gas. This cracked precursor gas results in the release of volatile organic compounds, and then you get a metallic-like layer that's attached to the surface of your material. There are a range of different parts of the mechanisms for scanning electron microscopy-based deposition, and effectively you can put this in this beautiful Venn diagram to show you the electron beam, so that will give you the energy, diameter, and current density. You can have the substrate. Is it going to be, what's the thermal and electrical properties? So how does it grow stuff and things, and the conduction? What's happening with regards to the electrons that are moving around the place? And the precursor is going to give you related to the volatility and reactivity. Then we have the interaction of the electron beam and the precursor, and that will relate to the dissociation mechanisms, the desorption, cross-sections, and growth regimes. What's important in that particular interaction of the electron beam and the precursor is effectively that the primary electron beam will interact and you'll produce a series of low energy secondary electrons. So that's effectively typically a secondary electron or electrons that are below 50 electron volts, and you get a very high number of secondary electrons that are generated. Depending on the particular precursor, those secondary electrons can have enough energy to cause chain scission of the precursor organic molecules. But in addition, you can get effectively that those electrons can come back as backscatter, or you can get secondary backscatter, you can get backscatter electrons, you can get Auger electrons, and you can get other secondary electrons that are produced in your material. And this can basically increase the cloud of locations where electrons of appropriate energies are generated, and that can impact the resolution of the deposition that's formed. You can also, so the electron interactions is effectively you can have the high energy primary electrons that cause methane release, and the low energy cause chain scissions in the system. The interaction of the precursor and the substrate will effectively control how well you absorb and stick that onto the surface. The interaction of the electron beam and the substrate, well, that will control, for instance, how much you get heating of the systems, how many phonon interactions you get, how much backscatter, secondary electron yield and generation in that system. And the combination of all three will ultimately result in the quality in terms of how well it deposits, how fast it deposits, but the purity, resolution, and crystallinity of that. Now, one of the important aspects that's just worth bearing in mind is that if you do cryo-based works, then of course this will impact a few of these properties. One of the major aspects that we'll discuss in a short while is that the precursor can do weird stuff in a cryo-based system, effectively that it can condense. But you'll also get some other different regimes that can operate in a cryo-based approach. Now, if we just look at a comparison of the interactions of the ion beam and the secondary scanning electron microscope, we can see a whole range of key properties, the velocities and energy and momentum. But what's also important is that we can change the signal per 100 particles at 20 kiloelectron volts. What we see due to effectively the secondary electron yield is that we get like a 50 to 75% yield of secondaries. We actually also get a huge number of secondary electrons that are generated from our fib. So this is to say that although I argued that a huge amount of the ion-based build-up of that foil, of the deposition layer, is related to ion-matter interactions, the secondary electron generation for the ion interactions is also likely important. This deposition method can be used for a range of approaches, one of which could be, for instance, the creation of photonic nanostructures. And so this is a really nice example where we can have a series of photonic arrays that can change, and they can have different character due to the effectively the handedness of these corkscrews in these photonic systems. And so this is an example where we can change the polarization related to circular polarized light for these particular examples. Now, deposition again is a bit artisanal to make this work, But of course, we can see that the deposition, there will be variations for gallium and xenon-based deposition processes. We'll also get a variation depending on the precursors we've got, and this can cause issues with regards to crystallinity, chemistry, and protection issues. In terms of I-beam deposition, generally speaking, we want to manage the current, the spot size, and the scanning strategy to optimize that we're going to continually deposit our layer onto our material. And one of the pieces to recall is that visualization during this process using the ion beam, where the precursor gas has not been cleaned out of the system yet, can cause deposition. So that can cause contamination of your surface. E-beam deposition will depend on the primary energy of the beam, plus all the other interactions. It will of course depend on the surface shape. For instance, secondary electrons, you get an increase in secondary electron emission towards the edge of samples. It will also depend on the temperature of the system. The deposition rate therefore will change significantly with aspect ratio, and so that's very important, especially as you're building up, for instance, three-dimensional structures. Traditionally, what we would do is that we would do a quick deposition trial, and we might try this in the first instance on a piece of silicon because then we have a known substrate, and we might calibrate the rule of thumb. And the rule of thumb effectively is related to the deposition area and the current that you want to use, and you can have effectively a rule of thumb parameter that you want to find out which one you want to use. So broadly speaking, as you increase the area, you'll want to increase the current that you're going to use. You're also going to play a little bit with the dose time to improve the thicker of each layer, and you want to have a little bit of care with regards to the sample height in the microscope. And that will be important because that changes basically how much adsorption you get of the precursor gases on the surface of your material. Why do we use these deposition? Well, one example is to improve the quality of a cross-section. So if we put this strap on the surface of our material and then trench into it, we can get a beautiful curtain-free cross-section because we have a nice amorphous layer for this. We can also have alternative methods, so we can do things like put a silicon wafer cap or other on this. And this cross-sectioning will be very useful because a smooth surface improves the contrast associated with things like crystallinity, porosity, and chemical composition in the scanning electron microscopy modes. Now, in the cross-section approach, we're going to hopefully reduce redeposition. That's why we've used this sort of staircase method as presented here. And what we basically then do is we tilt the sample to make sure we present this at a nice angle to the scanning electron microscope to enable us to do measurements, for instance, of film thickness of this particular regions in that sample. Now, the precursor cap can have effect on cross-sectioning, and this will depend, of course, on your ion species. We got some very nice demo work kindly by the colleagues in Thermo-Fisher Nanoport, where they played with different compositions. In some microscopes, you can change the relative compositions of different gas mixes. And in this case, for xenon cross-sectioning on an Inconel 718, we see that tungsten gives us the smoothest surface for this particular example. And that's why we selected in our microscope for our analytical approach to use tungsten for most systems in here. Most instruments will be limited in what GISs they've got set up. It depends on how the instrument is configured and how much budget people had. But there are a few bits and pieces that are worth exploring occasionally for this. So do some of these little trials to test cross-sections. Here we basically had a right-angle polished sample that then was cut into with this very systematic trial to establish which is the best route for our tomography experiments. Now, one of the things just for cross-sections, you just want to be slightly careful when you're doing measurements, is that of course, effectively, as you're cross-sectioning with the fib, the SEM will be at an angle. It depends on the microscope, but our instrument I think is 55 degrees for this. And effectively you'll have to use that to correct the foreshortening, because if you measured in the SEM this distance between this feature and the edge, the true distance is of course at this angle. So you just do the foreshortening correction. You can do this in ImageJ or calculate it relatively quickly, and actually you can also do it on most of the microscopes where they'll select the imaging mode to do a foreshortening as required for this. So that's just to bear in mind with this. So we've talked about deposition. We can also change the gas injection system now to put some different gases, so chlorine in here, or etc. And so what we effectively can do is, as we introduce chlorine or a halide in this system, we can use the focused ion beam that activates the process, and then effectively the chlorine can split to give you chloride. The chloride can interact with the silicon, and you can get silicon tetrachloride that's produced that no longer redeposits on the surface. And the consequence of this is that you can now significantly improve the etching rates by typically like a factor of 10 if you select it nicely for the different precursor. Now importantly, this enhancement of the etch rates will depend on the material system and whether it's sensitive. So there's a little bit of calibration that's required, but there are some specific examples. And why this can be really nice is that you can actually use this to selectively depackage. And so in this example, you can use water etching to preferentially remove polyamide passivation layers and effectively leaving aluminum structures present. So you can see how the aluminum wires are here. This is very important for the semiconductor because effectively 10 times cutting rates is 10 times less beam time on your instrument. In academic environments, we probably don't use etching as often, just because it's expensive to put more GIS systems compared to us just of the one-offs that we're operating. But of course, if you're in a semiconductor lab, they may have more likely to use these systems. So it depends. So if we look at different GIS-based precursors, there's a whole range of different ones that are out there, but we call them like a platinum precursor. We recognize that there are a range of different chemistries and it may depend on who your supplier is for this, but here's a few different precursors that's present. And we see the example that the platinum capping is very commonly used as a gallium capping layer and mask repair. Tungsten, we like it for effectively xenon-based capping layers and circuit edits in this case. Carbon can be very useful as alternative to platinum, but it has a poorer conductivity and relatively low contrast on high contrast substrates. Insulators, we can do circuit edits and form effectively silicon oxide and amorphous silicon oxide if you do it nicely. You can also deposit gold with a different structure. You can do a carbon milling based process to use the water base to mill the polymers faster. And you can have halide based systems as indicated to get selected milling. If you're interested, there's a very good list of different ones as presented on this website here. So when you're practically doing this to mill and to manage the etching process, things to worry about are things like charging. So you want to manage this on difficult to mill samples, temperature charging effects. You want to make sure, especially in deposition approaches, that your sample is as conductive as possible. You want to ground the sample to the stub, and one thing you can do is you can coat nearby to the field of view. That coating could be a macroscopic coating. So one of the things we can do, for instance, is we might put a small bit of paper over the field of view that we care about, and then deposit a carbon coat over the rest of the sample to get it to be nice and conductive. With this system, you can also use the manipulator to act as a charge compensation tool, or you can use a flood gun, and that can be important with regards to the gas injection system and how we manage that depositing. Of course, in the fib, all the systems, the sample should be vacuum stable. If it degasses or you get volatile samples, etc., that can impact both milling, polishing, and deposition processes. And of course, the sample should be as flat as possible. That enables us to tilt to get our E-beam and I-beam deposition, and also enables us to have access with our manipulator and gas injection system. So, hopefully from this lecture 4, I've highlighted that the gas injection system can be used to introduce an organic precursor for E-beam or I-beam based deposition. We can also use an etching gas that binds with the sputter to reduce redeposition in this. And effectively, we're going to have some care with the ion electron beam methods. We're going to worry a bit about the interactions for certain cases. And one of the important aspects is if the GIS valve is open, is to recall that the electron beam will deposit everywhere in that system. So with that, we conclude lecture 4, and the next lecture will be looking at machining, fib lift out, and 3D analysis.